So good morning to one and all. Welcome to the second episode of Guidance's Thought Leadership Series, wherein we bring thought leaders from industry, academia, think tank, research bodies, businesses, and governments to deliberate and discuss issues and insights on economy, investments, policy, technology, and investment climate. Guidance is a nodal agency for investment promotion and facilitation for the government of Tamil Nadu. Guidance provides a wide range of services to large-scale industries, from site selection, single window clearances, to incentives, and to aftercare services. You may visit our website, Investing in Tamil Nadu, to learn more about us. My name is Gaurav Daga, and I'm Associate Vice President Guidance for Investment Promotion. For our today's episode, we are delighted to host Ananth Krishnan, an experienced journalist and author of a recently published book, India's China Challenge, A Journey Through China's Rise and What It Means for India. His book attempts to unpack India's fourfold challenge with China, the political challenge, the economic challenge, the diplomatic and the military challenge, and challenge of history. Ananth is the China correspondent for The Hindu. In 2019, he was a visiting fellow at the Brookings, India. He was previously the associate editor at the India Today Group in Beijing until August 2018. He has lived in Beijing since 2009. Ananth's reportage has focused on China's relationship with India, China's neighbourhood diplomacy, its domestic politics, Tibet and Xinjiang. He has closely tracked Sino-India relationship for a decade from various perspectives and questions, from boundary dispute to rapidly expanding trade relations with the countries. He holds a master's degree in social sciences from the University of Chicago, focusing on a very interesting topic, politics of film industry in Tamil Nadu, and a bachelor's degree in economics and history from UCLA. Earlier this year, in March 2020, Ananth published an impact series paper at Brookings, India, titled Following the Money, China Inc.'s Growing Stake in India-China Relationship. The paper traces the growth of Chinese investment in India. For those interested in learning and examining this growing states of Chinese companies in India and assessing their relationship, I recommend reading this paper. For our today's session, Ananth will share his insights on China's experience in bringing inward investment, the evolution of Chinese economy, India-China relationship, the trajectory of Chinese investment in India, and finally, what can states like Tamil Nadu learn from Chinese growth story to build its own economic story. So before I hand over the floor to Ananth, a few housekeeping remarks. So I think Ananth will speak for about 20-30 minutes. Then we will open the floor for Q&A. For all the participants, I will request you either send the questions to me or Guidance Tamil Nadu, the host. I shall then collate those questions and pose it to Ananth, and then we will end the session by a brief vote of thanks. Over to you, Ananth.
Thank you so much, Gaurav, for the introduction. And good morning to everybody at Guidance and others who are listening. Do let me know if you have any issues hearing me at any stage. So what I thought I would do is just focus on the China aspect in the next 15 minutes, and maybe the bilateral aspect, I'll touch upon it a bit, but maybe we can come to that in the Q&A in terms of the India-China trade and investment relationship, how that's changing, the current situation after the boundary crisis, and where we go from here. I thought I'd focus more on the China side of it today. So as Gaurav said, the book that I've just written is my attempt to try and make sense of the last 10 years of China when I was based there as a reporter for The Hindu and then India Today. So it's really it's a book about my own experience of this past decade and how I made sense of the political, economic, social changes in China. I should first tell you what the book is not. It's not a book by an expert or an economist. I'm not, or a guy who knows trade stuff. It's a reporter's perspective and mainly informed by interviews that I did on the business side, whether it's with factory owners in South China, whether it's Indian companies in China. There's quite a few of perspectives of Indian businessmen who live in China as well. So in the book, I identify 4 challenges that India faces, and each of these challenges is addressed in a separate part of the book. The first is the political challenge, of course, of dealing with China's rise as a one-party state So it's about trying to understand the values of this one party state and of the Communist Party, especially when it's trying to increasingly, to some degree, shape global institutions in line with what its values are, which are very different, of course, from the values of the West. The second is the economic challenge, which I'll talk about today. I addressed this in 3 chapters. I first look at China's manufacturing miracle, how that happened. The second chapter, which I most enjoyed writing, was looking at the transition from rural China to urban China and the urbanization process, the winners and losers, trying to look at what we can learn, what to do, what not to do, the impact on the environment, the pollution challenge. The third chapter I look at is the tech chapter, the emergence of China as a tech power, as an innovating power, something that a lot of people thought would never happen. They thought it was a country that could do factories, it could do low end manufacturing. And a lot of people were skeptical that they could go up the value chain, but yet they have managed to do that and now have leading global tech companies such as Alibaba, Tencent, and even Huawei. What I thought, and then of course, the third challenge is the diplomatic and military challenge of the bilateral relationship, how it's evolved, and the central role of the boundary question and how it impacts everything else in this relationship. And fourthly, I look at the historical challenge of how we deal with the memory of the 62 war, the unresolved border, and what the prospects are of settling the boundary, which I argue in the book is essential if we really want to try and have a more productive relationship. So today I'll focus mainly on part 2 of the book, which is the economic challenge, and especially on the manufacturing side of things. I think both China's emergence as a manufacturing power and its tech emergence have had huge implications for India and the bilateral relationship. I think it's no surprise that India imports more goods from China than any other country, worth around $75 billion last year, out of two-way trade of about $93 billion. After China, the most important goods come from the US, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. And all three of these together account for a little less than what China alone sells to India. So it's not only, I think in the public perception in India is we just import low-end type of goods, whether it's low-end electronics or even low-end toys, those kind of made in China products. But actually, if you look at the trade basket, even as China's manufacturing has gone up the value chain, so have the kind of goods that we are importing from China, including a lot of advanced machinery. In the year 2019, China accounted for 73% of India's telecom equipment, 82% of semiconductor devices, 80% of antibiotics, 75% of active pharmaceutical ingredients, without which our pharma industry cannot function. All of this explains why I think year after year, even though the political problems in the relationship lead to debates about can we boycott China, oftentimes that really doesn't have an impact. And I think that the latest trade data that I have seen for 2020 also suggests that the boundary events this year have not had a huge impact on the trade numbers as far as I can tell. The numbers have fallen, I think, after our lockdown and after general downturn in the Indian economy. But the trend seems to have gone up a little bit in the last few months, which suggests that a lot of our import dependencies cannot really be substituted overnight. I think that obviously the fact that it's cheaper for Indian companies to send designs to a factory in South China, whether it is for, I look at some of the more stranger things we are importing, with not only custom-made furniture, but even things like paintings and artwork with Indian themes. The fact that we're having them sent to China and shipped here, I think it both shows the success of what they did right, and of course what we haven't been able to do. I think the conventional wisdom generally is that they were able to do this manufacturing success story because they have the centralized, efficient state that is able to carry out large-scale projects with the speed that we obviously can only dream of. I think, of course, that's a very widespread perception. I think when we look at what China did right, we tend to think of the big cities, the skyscrapers, the special economic zones. But in the book, I try and go beyond that. And because a lot of what we associate with the China growth stories are things that came in the 90s and 2000s. But actually, if you go back and look at the start of their economic rise, a lot of it happened in the preceding decade in the 80s, which is largely absent from our own uh, attention and imagination. And I think it matters because if you look at the 80s, you come away with a slightly different picture from understanding what they did right. And you come away with a sense that it's not just having top down policies, it's not just having an authoritarian state that can put in a lot of money into big infrastructure projects, but actually, you also understand the role of bottom up, the role of economic entrepreneurs in rural areas who really started this whole process. I think that in the book, I draw a lot on the research of the MIT economist Huang Yasheng, who has done quite pioneering work in looking at the role of rural China and the role of rural economic reforms that underpinned what happened in urban China. And the point that he makes quite convincingly is that the first major thing that they were able to do was improve agricultural yields. And of course, a lot of that happened when they ended the commune system. And from the late 70s and early 80s, you had this groundswell of what were called township and village enterprises, TVEs, which were essentially private enterprises that were able to really produce a whole surge in economic growth. And in fact, until the mid 90s, actually, though we assume a lot of private sector China as being synonymous with urban China, actually, almost 50% of private sector activity in China up until the mid to late 90s was in rural China, not in urban China. There were by 1985, there were almost 70 million people working in the rural private sector, if we can call it that. And as Huang Yasheng asks, people ask, where did a country, a low-income country like China, which in the mid 80s actually was poorer per capita wise than India was in mid 80s. So he asked, how was such a country able to get the money to finance everything that they did in terms of infrastructure? And he says a lot of it was rural China. It's not just FDI. We focus a lot on FDI. It was important, and I'll come to the role of FDI, but it was minuscule in comparison to the role of the prosperity of rural China played. In the book, I spend quite some time in the city of Yiwu, which, if you haven't heard of, is perhaps one of the most important cities in terms of India-China trade. It is in Zhejiang province, and I think that a lot of goods that we source from China pass through Yiwu. There are more Indians in Yiwu than any other foreign nationality. There's a floating Indian population. There's a registered Indian population, I think, of around 5,000 people, but visitors of about 1 lakh every year. I spent some time with a very interesting person called Pradeep Shetty, who has been in China since 1994. And he is a leading figure of the Indian business community in South China and in Yiwu. He sources a variety of goods from China, such as electronic items, bags, luggage, and he even has a factory in China where he is producing sunglasses that he sells to the US, and he supplies for major brands such as Ray-Ban. So he's actually an interesting case of an Indian who is manufacturing in China and exporting it all over the world, including to India. In terms of Yiwu's experience, as he put it to me, the township and village enterprises played a big role. It was actually a very rural town, and they found that when they had a lot of excess stock at the end of the year, they first started offering it to traders from the Middle East. And then from there, it came traders to Southeast Asia and then India. And the rest is history in terms of how Yiwu emerged as a linchpin in global supply chains. And it all began with these TVEs. I think looking at the role of these rural entrepreneurs, one thing that we should also look at is the effect of investments in health and education in rural China that played a very important role in the 60s and 70s, despite all of the chaos and the turmoil of the Maoist years. That was one legacy that actually bore fruit in the 80s. And there is some research that suggests that why so many Chinese took to entrepreneurship in a way that other rural populations in Asia did not was because of this role of education. Um, I think that coming to the 90s and trying to understand the role played by provincial governments in South China, it is quite interesting. Obviously, would flag Guangdong, Zhejiang, and Jiangsu as three big provinces that were at the center of China's manufacturing story and export story as well. I think that one thing that really struck me when I interviewed Indian and other foreign CEOs in China was the role played by provincial governments in attracting them and making investments easy, in making infrastructure and land very easy. And one reason why they did all of this was internally a very important metric in assessing a local official's performance and whether they would get promoted. One of the metrics was the amount of investment they would get in their state. The other metric was the number of foreign companies that were registered in their state. And so this was something that really drove them to look outside China. The other second dynamic that I always found interesting was interstate competition for investment. I think that you would know more about this than I, but I think you're getting this dynamic in India as well, where if Guangdong made you an offer, it's very possible that Zhejiang would match that offer and then maybe throw in free land. But beyond infrastructure, which we tend to be obsessed with, in many of my conversations, the role of labor really came up as something very, very important. And I think what really surprised me was it wasn't just about the cheapness of labor. I think cheap labor was certainly important in the early 1990s and the initial phase when you had this influx of farmers and migrant workers coming to cities to get out of rural poverty. And obviously did help in matching this the China price, the fact that labor was so cheap. But by the time I made my first visits to factories in 2010 and 2011, the situation was actually very different. The most common thing I heard starting 2010, 2011 was that wages were increasing 20% every year. I think now, 10 years down the line, the trend is even more clear. In 2010 and 11, there was a surge of strikes and protests in factories in China, which again was a huge shock to me, which was showing that the balance of power has really shifted from factories to labor. I think that one thing that people in India are surprised is the fact that I think labor is much more empowered in India than it is in China, despite being supposedly communist. They really don't have independent unions. And the biggest issue that Chinese investors often complain about when coming to India is dealing with Indian labor and dealing with unions in India. That's something that's alien to them, because in China, the unions are all party controlled. And actually, the official Chinese Federation of Trade Unions, the way they handle labor unrest is actually they do what they can to suppress it. So they're rather a voice for the party rather than the voice for the labor in China. Broadly, I'm making a generalization here. But despite these restrictions, by the time that I was traveling in 2010, 2011, the agency of workers had really changed. In fact, now it wasn't the case where there was a surplus of labor. Now it was the factories that were struggling to find good labor and cheap labor. So actually, you're in a situation where the workers had bargaining power that they didn't have in the past. This, I think, coincided with the trend of many Chinese companies and foreign companies trying to move out to Southeast Asia, especially, and to Bangladesh to a certain extent, for low-end goods such as clothes and toys. And a lot of sort of outbound shift has happened in the last few years. But what is interesting is that if you look at slightly up the value chain, there isn't really much shifting happening. And I think that in the book, I quote Tim Cook of Apple, who spoke about the role of Chinese labor in Apple's own supply chains. And I thought the point that he made was interesting, where he said that the popular conception that Apple was in China because of low labor costs was completely wrong. And he said the reason they were there is because of the quantity of skill that they've had in one location. And I think he credits the the vocational training system, where they're really churning out a huge number of workers every year as something. And he had this great quote where he said that in the US, if you had a meeting of tooling engineers, that he would struggle to fill one room, but in China, he could actually fill a football field if he had to do that. So I think that the big question, of course, on our minds is, can this manufacturing success story be repeated and recreated? I think that two things that I think somewhat made it unique to China were its location and timing. That suggests that the prospect of replicating this appears unlikely. In terms of location, they had the example of Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, and their neighborhood. And of course, they had Hong Kong as well, which was this very unique bubble that had a rule of law, that had international standards, that was able to attract overseas Chinese to come back. And so it was a very important bridge for China with the world. And I think that the timing, of course, helped them as well in terms of the era of globalization. And now we are confronting the end of this era of globalization, when I think supply chains are becoming more localized. A little bit in terms of the East Asian experience, I think, of course, for China, the role of foreign firms was really something unique compared to what happened in other East Asian countries. FDI averaged, I think, at about 3% of China's GDP in the 20-year period leading up to 2005. And that was only 0.5% for South Korea and Taiwan, and about even less than that for Japan. I think foreign firms played a huge role in the second part of the 90s and early 2000s in terms of China's export industry. I think that the fact that something like 75% of their high-tech exports from China to the world weren't by Chinese companies, they were by foreign companies based in China. This was something that Chinese policymakers were happy to deal with. I don't know if our policymakers would be happy with that, because from their point of view, the trade-off was this: even if you were allowing these American companies and European companies to do what they were doing, they were obviously absorbing their technology. So it was a trade-off of getting their technology and access in return for giving them access to the China market. And I think these companies were very happy with this deal until now, when they are now dealing with Chinese competitors, and they feel now that, which is why you're hearing America, for example, complain a lot about IPR theft, about these unfair arrangements. But quite honestly, these were arrangements they were very happy to tolerate when they were making money. And it's just now that obviously they are, which is why now they're trying to move out. Now, I think that one question obviously is, why is it that the Chinese were able to get so much FDI year on year, far more than India has been getting, even though India is far more open, even though India has a rule of law, an independent legal system, which you would think ostensibly are things that matter for foreign investors. I think one thing that people keep coming back to is the question of skill sets of labor, and besides that, infrastructure, obviously. Now, obviously, I think we're coming to a new situation where I think Chinese companies are struggling to go global and do what their colleagues in low-end manufacturing did, only because of the fact that I think the world right now is moving to a stage where they aren't really welcoming of Chinese companies, especially Chinese tech companies. And here, obviously, we presumably might have an opportunity. I just recently did a piece for the Hindu last Sunday about Shenzhen, which turned 40 this month. So it's quite interesting that companies in Shenzhen are now finding a very hostile reception when they're trying to go abroad, unlike what was the case 30 years ago, because of the fact that the whole global mood has changed, both in terms of globalization and specifically in terms of doing business with China. I think that because of the uniqueness of the Chinese party state, I think a lot of countries are now worried about opening up to Chinese companies like Huawei that have very ambiguous relationship with the Chinese authorities. And all this now is a last word. All of this is now manifesting in the India-China relationship as well. I think up until 2014, 2015, it was largely a buy-sell relationship where we were importing large quantities of goods. That has now changed. since 2014, the Indian government had made it a policy priority to attract investments from China. While in Beijing over the last 5 years, I saw so many seminars that were being organized by Invest India in getting Chinese companies to put money in India. I think this was quite successful, and the amount of investment has really surged over the last 5-6 years, probably more than $10 billion right now. But the problem, as far as India was concerned, is this money from China wasn't coming in really to the sectors that India wanted. There was some, of course, there's been a huge increase in Chinese assembly, mobile phone companies that are doing assembly here. But a lot of this money was also going into startups to acquire stakes in Indian companies. And I think that we can talk about this in the Q&A, but I think that starting April, even before the border crisis, I think the government in Delhi had decided to put a stop to this and to be more stringent in terms of policing the kind of investments that were coming in from China. I think a lot of Chinese investors are concerned that whether this is a blanket ban on Chinese investment. I don't think that's the case. It seems to be an attempt to redirect investment from things like investing stakes in companies to greenfield projects. So I think that they're still quite open to having companies come in if it means actually investing in projects and creating jobs. But of course, the problem is that reading the Chinese media, it seems to be that they seem to have spooked all kinds of Chinese investment. And I think that's something that India has to now negotiate, since obviously we are facing an economic crisis at home and we really aren't spoiled for choice in getting investment from abroad. So how we are able to position ourselves and get the kind of Chinese investment that is beneficial to India and not harmful to India, I think that's the challenge that we now face going forward. I think, Gaurav, I will stop there.
Thank you, Ananth. That was quite insightful. And I think you have given us a broad overview of the 1980s and how it has progressed till 2020. And, the kind of shifts we have seen both internally and in kind of China-India relationship. So thank you for that. I mean, while we gather questions, I have few myself. I mean, you have rightly identified that, global conditions have changed and supply chains are, cannot be dismantled in a day or two. It's not so easy for state governments to really, try to leverage upon those let's say geopolitical tensions. But I also see in your book that and in your papers that you identify skilling as an important criteria to states governments to build upon. Now, talking from the perspective of Tamil Nadu, if you see, the state government and the history of Tamil Nadu has been pretty good on education and health. So what I'm just thinking out loud, what should the state governments do to really build up its skilling system and then add value to the kind of investments which come in? So that is one question I have, maybe from your experience. I mean, you have told us vocational skilling, but anything else you have in your mind which could help us to really think about in terms of policy solutions?
Sure. I think that from my own experience, if you look at the pattern of Chinese investment in India, it seems that I think Andhra, Tamil Nadu, Gujarat and Maharashtra have been 4 states that generally, from my own vantage point in Beijing, have been looked upon favorably for investment. So I really don't think it's a skilling issue. I think right now, the big challenge has gone beyond that. I think that I think you yourself are aware that the last 2 years, there's been a lot of intent from Chinese companies to invest in Tamil Nadu, especially after the October summit. I have personally received a lot of inquiries from Chinese firms that were looking to come here. And I think that they were not really hampered by a lack of skill sets or labor problems in these states, as far as I could tell. I think now the biggest problem, as far as I could see it, is that while a lot has been happening between Beijing and Delhi, I think at the state to provincial level, there's been a real deficit of direct engagement and interaction, and that has been the biggest problem. Because I think in India and China, obviously everything is done at the state level. Even in China, the misconception is you do something in Beijing, actually not. You have to do business at the state to provincial level, and those avenues haven't been created by both countries. I think that when Prime Minister Modi went to China in 2015, he had a great initiative of creating the state and provincial leaders forum. But the sad fact is that the only meeting it ever had was when he visited in 2015, and he had taken 3 chief ministers with him, and it never was reconvened since. And I think that there are individual cases of these links being created. But again, the biggest fact is you have Delhi has been very prominent in coming to Beijing seeking investment. But then the problem is when Chinese companies go to Delhi, frankly, the word of Delhi means not very much when you end up going down to your actual state where you're going to do business. I think the biggest thing that would help is creating these avenues independent of Delhi and Beijing, which I think were happening. But now, obviously, I think a lot of this is now thrown into doubt because of the policy uncertainty following the boundary crisis. And until that is going to be resolved, if it's ever going to be resolved in this year or next year, it is going to be, I think, a challenge to get these avenues created. But for me, I would flag that as the biggest obstacle so far, is that you really haven't had a channel for people to engage on this level.
I think you're absolutely right in terms of identifying that, the kind of interactions has to go beyond New Delhi, Beijing, but also, Chennai and which Shenzhen or Shanghai and whatever you have on the other end, and to bilaterally see how can both the state governments and provincial governments can work together to really, cater and bring those investments in. And Tamil Nadu, I mean, last year was as I was telling you earlier, was an opportune moment for us because of the high level focus which state received due to the Prime Minister's visit with Xi Jinping. But now I think, as I was telling you earlier, it's not just the economic issue, but I foresee that the other kind of challenges interplay with each other, and that kind of put an end to, or I mean, not in a literal sense, but in a kind of the sense of, they overtake the kind of relationship which you have built over the 1 year, and then suddenly you see a shift in there. So that is one comment I had. But the second question, if I move on, is in terms of the rural-urban migration, which you have talked about in your book, and specifically the hukou system, right? I mean, it's kind of an internal passport you have in China. But do you have any insights or learnings? Because I see a lot of similar migration happening internally within the state. People are generally from the south side of the state who come and work in the north side of the state because the industries are clusters are here, and similarly, or in the west side of the state. But is there any learnings for agencies like us to really think about how to do industrial housing or affordable housing and so on, so that those clusters are not just for industries but also providing an avenue for people to come and stay? And I see a lot of such clusters developed in China, but maybe if you have some comments or suggestions for us from there.
No, absolutely. And to your first point, I think you're right that I think that now we're at an interesting stage in the relationship where this trying to compartmentalize the boundary and the security problems from the business problems, I think that that's going to become less and less possible, even though that was a case for quite some time. But I think you're right that I think now increasingly, even if this current crisis is past, I find it difficult to imagine us going back to an era where these you had unresolved problems on the boundary, but the government was actually actively bullish about opening up Chinese investment. I don't think we're going to go back to that. So I think that's going to be a hurdle going forward. But I think the realistic constraints that we face and the investment that we clearly need would mean that I think that some of these things are temporary. I think, for example, opening up to, I think we're going to police more carefully companies like Alibaba, Tencent coming in to buy Indian companies. Things like the Paytm investment, I find that's going to be hard to get approval for going forward. But companies like, say, Oppo or Xiaomi wanting to open factories to assemble here, frankly, I think those things, it's going maybe not in the next few months, but I think finally, once we settle to a new normal, I think that we're going to have to be open to that. And I think we'd be shooting ourselves in the foot. There's no security threat from having a Chinese company coming in and hiring 10,000 Indian workers to assemble phones here. I mean, I think we have to look at it realistically, is my own point of view. I think in terms of migration, their example is quite interesting, but obviously hard to replicate only because of the fact that they were trying to police migration in such a way that, uh, frankly, the hukou system has been good and bad for them. They would argue that the benefit has been that they were able to not they were able to control migration and not have, for example, the development of unregulated housing clusters in cities. And how the hukou system obviously enabled that was it completely disincentivized people to move with their families. So basically, the children were generally forced to get educated in their hometowns and villages, and while the parents moved and earned money and sent it back. And that was generally broadly the model that worked. And the parents' housing was taken care of because companies and factories had to house them. It was incumbent on all people hiring from the countryside that they had to take care of the housing of workers, which is why you wouldn't have a situation like we did at this lockdown, when you had this huge population that the companies abdicated the responsibility of looking after them, and they were caught in between their places of work and their places of residence. So that kind of situation obviously did not arise in China, precisely because of this fact that oftentimes people don't move with their families. But having said that, obviously that the urban population still has increased in a huge way because of the fact that you had migration, not just of migrant workers who would be limited by this hukou system, but generally of people seeking employment along with their families, moving and changing their residence from rural to urban in tier 2 towns. And that has happened, I think, because of the fact that you had tier 2 towns to absorb this migration. It wasn't just 4 or 5 big tier 1 cities that did this. I think there was a policy decision to have, basically what they did was they would say that if you were a migrant worker, you would be disincentivized from moving to a Beijing or Shanghai or a Guangzhou because you couldn't take your families with you. But if you moved to a smaller satellite town, you could actually enroll your kid in a school over there, which is how they tried to direct the flow. And I think they were broadly successful in doing that. So I think the role of tier 2, tier 3 towns, satellite towns, was something very, very important in absorbing the population from rural areas.
Thank you. I have one question on the environmental sustainability perspective. You have mentioned that India needs to be careful in the kind of investments we want to attract. I mean, of course, the kind of investments we want to attract have never come in, right? I mean, government wants to attract investments in pharmaceuticals, in semiconductors, and so on. But as you rightly point out, it is going in terms of real estate, housing, startups, and so on, or industrial parks. But this is a special significance to the pharma sector, given the dependency on APIs and on bulk drugs is very high in China, and the government with its Atmanirbhar program wants to indigenize production within the country and reduce dependency. But do you think China has like a grander plan to dispose of this highly polluting, let's say, industries, and then move themselves to less polluting industries, and they kind of incentivize these industries to venture out, and while we as are overly dependent, we would welcome them with open arms because we would want to reduce our dependency. So is there a movement or kind of a shift internally in Beijing or in China where they are keen to venture out and investment in countries like India, where there is a great scope and market?
I think for sure. I think yes and no, to the degree that I think that I did earlier when we were talking, give you the example of this plastics manufacturer who was the kind of guy that his options, as he put it to me, his options were either he was in Jiangsu and Zhejiang, which are trying to rid themselves of these kind of industries. So, but he said his options were going to India, Southeast Asia, or to Western China. So that's the other thing. So I think if you look at China internally as well, a lot of these companies that are moving out, we're looking at South and Eastern China that have been really at the forefront of manufacturing. They still lag. Western China still actually is lagging behind the provinces in the West that are underinvested, that have employment problems. So I think that there are companies moving out internally within China from East to West, as well as looking abroad as well. So I'd say yes and no. in India, obviously, I think the challenge we have to face, as I said, is going to be how do we manage this thing where we try and direct the investment to areas we want without scaring them off entirely. I think that's going to be the challenge we have to face. And I think that we'll only have to wait for a while once this boundary crisis passes before. I think right now it's going to be a hard sell for any Indian state or the central government to go and try and get Chinese investment in, because of the fact that I'm sure within China as well, informally, probably they're not going to be encouraged to go out to India at the current moment.
Thank you. Another question we have received is on the issue of the Indian regulations. So right now we are seeing a lot of Chinese companies who are made their investment plans in India but are stuck for months for the want of approval and clearances from the central government. And that is one issue wherein do you see any kind of easing out restrictions from the center, or do you think only after the boundary issue, when there's a kind of a peace settlement informally, that they would work on more on the economic side of the relationship?
I think it would be the latter, only because I think that it was important for India to send a message that I think the Chinese were working under this assumption that you can do what you want on the boundary and still continue things elsewhere. But I think it was important for India to send a message that, listen, you cannot pick and choose, that you can't carry out an aggression on the boundary and then assume that other aspects of the relationship are going to work. So I think the message from India this time around was that this compartmentalization business can't continue, and it was important to send that message. I think, as I saw it. So I think this boundary can still go three ways. I think this week there's going to be another eighth round of talks. I'd say the best case scenario is that both quietly find a way to disengage and go back. I think the second scenario would be that you continue as you are throughout the winter. I think both sides are preparing for it. If that's going to be the situation, then I think that for the next few months, it's still going to be difficult to imagine investments going ahead and being cleared. And then I'd say worst case scenario is having a repeat of what happened in June. I think if that happens, then probably you can expect even further measures. We haven't had new measures for a while. You had the app ban, you had this scrutiny of investments in highways and power and procurement, but it's been a pause. So I think even the government's waiting to see if it goes. So I think it entirely hinges on whether you have which of these three outcomes, either a disengagement or a complete continuation of the current situation, which would mean no change, or if things get worse, then I think you would have even further stringent controls. So I would say it's entirely contingent on how things play out on the ground.
But I mean, just few days back, you see, India hinted an opening of evaluating talks with Taiwan specifically. And they thought that could be one avenue to kind of open up and see if there's kind of a economy side of the question can be taken from that perspective. And so how do you think China would react? I mean, they have already reacted, but what is your take on it if India and Taiwan would like to engage with each other bilaterally? Because this would open up a big question, I presume, for political perspective and diplomatic perspective.
So I think that I don't think India is going to change in a big way its approach to Taiwan. I'm skeptical that we're going to continue without recognizing Taiwan. I don't think that's going to change. But I think that, frankly, there's so much going on economically. I think more better than I do in terms of Taiwanese companies in India. And I don't think it is really not having formal diplomatic ties really hasn't hindered getting investment from Taiwan, as far as I could understand. In 2018, there was an investment agreement that was signed, and because India-China relations were in a good place, the Chinese did not even object to India and China and Taiwan signing the 2018 investment agreement. So they may object now, but I think the point that Indian officials have made correctly, that Taiwan has been a huge investor in mainland China, and Taiwanese companies are all over the place in China. So for China to object to Taiwanese companies doing business with India, I think, frankly, that it's just some noise. I think there's no reason why India shouldn't be more bullish. I think going after trying to entice Foxconn and those other two companies to invest was the right thing to do. And frankly, there's a lot more that we can do with Taiwan on the business side without necessarily getting into the political side of things. I don't think it's a either or.
Thank you. Another question which I have received is on the question of state-owned enterprises in China. So one of the participants would like to know, how has China dealt with its own non-performing SOEs, and what can India learn from it for its own PSUs?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think if you look at the phase from the early 2000s to until recently, until Xi took over, I think there was a lot of appetite and intent from China to streamline its SOEs, and they did it. If you look at the number of people employed in the state sector, it was progressively decreasing from the time of early 2000 reforms up until, I would say, up until 2013, 2014. There was a huge decrease in employment. They were forced to restructure. So I think they did quite a bit. But from what I'm reading recently coming out of China, that process has either stopped or has been reversing under Xi Jinping, where I think they are. They have decided that in so-called strategically important sectors that they want the SOEs to play a leading role. I think that in the financial sector, obviously, it's still SOE dominated. So there seems to be, at least right now, a pause in a lot of what pro-reform Chinese economists wanted is kind of halted. And I think the current leadership in China seems to think that the SOEs have a very big role to play in strategically important sectors, uh, and especially in this whole civil military fusion that they're talking about. So what they did in the early 2000s, they had to do, and they did it really well in terms of downsizing, in terms of, even though it was laying off people was a huge thing. Uh, I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but there was a huge period of layoffs of people who were employed in SOEs from throughout the 90s and early 2000s, and there were things that they had to do. But I think now it's come to, I think the process has gone as far as it has, and now in a strange way, I think you're going the other direction now.
Thank you. One last final question. Your book beautifully describes about the EU market. Do you elaborate more on your experiences and the kind of interactions you have had there?
For sure. I think it was one of the most interesting places that I like to visit in China. And I think I did about 4 trips, only because you had a very interesting business community. The EU market is so huge that, as I mentioned in the book, it will take you a year to actually, even if you went there every day, you can't cover it. So I went very targeted. I looked up online Chinese companies that were sourcing to India. So I would go and focus on those Chinese companies. And I came across so many interesting people there from Africa, Middle East, India. One of the trips that I did there was for an unpleasant story where you had these two Indian traders working for UAE companies who were kidnapped because their company actually owed 10 million yuan, about 10 crores, and the owner of the company fled. So you have a lot of these cases where uh, foreign companies, swindling happens both ways. Where you have Chinese companies swindle their foreign customers, and the other way around. Actually, I interestingly found more often it happened the other way around. Though our perception of China is that it's not very trustworthy among many Indian business people, but actually it happened more the other way around, because you would have companies coming from Africa or the Middle East. They would do 2 years of transactions to build trust. Then they would place a massive order, and then they would vanish without paying for it. So this was a case where a company had placed an order for $10 million yuan worth of goods and then fled. The owner vanished. So these two people who were, unfortunately, their representatives in EU, were held as collateral by the Chinese partners, who said, we're not going to let them go until your owner pays the money. So it was a very bad standoff. And finally, I think it was resolved because it became a diplomatic issue. And the Chinese were very upset. The Chinese companies were upset because these guys were allowed to go back, but I don't think they ever got their money back. So, but it is kind of like a Wild West kind of town where I don't think contracts mean anything. It's about having personal relationships with companies. The majority of relationships go well. Actually, the Indians that I interviewed in the middle of this incident were very critical of the Indian traders. They were actually saying, "Listen, if you pay, if you fulfill your end of the deal, if you are trustworthy, you'll be fine. You'll do well." That was the takeaway that I had. That's why till this day, the number of Indians going there, at least prior to the pandemic, was increasing year after year. So it's quite an interesting place.
Thank you, Ananth. I mean, that's all the time we have, and I hope today's discussion was useful to all those who could join, and surely it was for me. Thank you once again. And before I conclude, I will also like to inform other participants that we will be shortly announcing the speaker for our third episode. So, stay connected and follow us for more updates. Ananth, it was a pleasure hosting you, and we look forward to engaging you, in otherwise as well.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
so much. Thanks a lot, Gaurav, and look forward to
Thank you.
being in touch for
Thank
sure.
you. Take care. Bye-bye.